Oh boy, here we go. It's the Clark the Shark Show. You're not dead, you're not in heaven, but pretty damn close. I mean, I'd pretty much say it's the next best thing. Being on the Clark the Shark Show, 1-800-449-8255. From the golden EIB Sharkerphone, you're going to get the word on all the hard-hitting rock and roll albums from the 1970s, 60s. Who knows? I might do some 80s. That's probably my cutoff. I won't do much 90s or beyond here on the Clark the Shark Show. And I'm talking today about an amazing album from 1978. And of course, I'm talking about Genesis, and then there were three. Now, this is the first album they did after Steve Hackett left. They're just a three-piece. I don't even know how these guys carried on without Peter Gabriel first, and then without Steve Hackett. Two of the most important fixtures in the band are gone, leaving Tony Banks, who is an amazing keyboardist, and of course Rutherford on bass and guitar now on this album, and of course Phil on drums, vocals. And then when they played live, on this tour, they added Sturmer and Chester Thompson. The 1978, and then there were three tour. Very different from the band of 1977, Wind and Wuthering, that had Steve Hackett and Mike Rutherford jamming along with Chester Thompson, who replaced Bill Bruford, who, of course, Bill Bruford is one of the most amazing drummers, of course, from Yes. And he fit right in on the 1976 Genesis tour. And I always wondered why Bill Bruford didn't join Genesis, but, it's a little different vibe from Yes, and, it's, hey, that's the neato cool thing about the world, man. Everything's different. Eclectic, and a mixture, if you will, of different ideas, styles, collisions. It's what makes things great. Everything's diverse, and, Clark the Shark just loves it. I like Yes, and I like Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and I like Genesis, mainly with Peter Gabriel. But these three albums after Peter Gabriel leaves are very interesting, and those, of course, are Trick of the Tail, Wind and Wuthering, and this one from 1978. Now, this album is the most commercial Genesis album to date. It's before the album Duke, which is where Genesis went really more commercial, but still retained that progressive rock thing. Now, on this album, and then there were three, 1978, Genesis is really basically still a prog progressive band. They really are. But these songs are shorter, much more concise. And you can tell there is a new direction here all the way. They are leaning in the direction of commercial. And honestly, quite frankly, a lot of these songs could go right on the radio. Not just the one big hit on the album, but I can think of at least 4 or 5, maybe 6 of these songs that just sound like Phil Collins songs already here in 1978. A little more technical, a little more progressive than, what happened to this band later on in the 1980s, which is kind of a tragedy. Um, I really don't like um, the direction Genesis went. Of course, I don't. But I still listen to it, you know. I'll listen to all those albums just out of curiosity, possibly mainly as a guilty pleasure. But I'm not going to sit around and listen to, Three Sides Live and Genesis, and Invisible Touch like they're great albums. I might just listen to them for fun as a joke. But this album I consider the last Genesis album. Duke is interesting. It's got these real progressive jams all over the album, but it's got progressive songs and interesting songs on it. Duke certainly does. I love the song Cul-de-sac from Duke. Killer song. But we're here today to talk about And Then There Were Three, 1978. Just three guys in the studio, joined by two touring musicians live. But in the studio, Rutherford and not Hackett, he's gone. Rutherford and Banks are now banging out the music, with Phil banging on his drums and singing. And it's really interesting, this album. Uh, these songs are, I don't care what the reviews are. To me, it's too transitional of an album to worry about 5 stars or, there you see it gets 3 and 4, 3.5, something like that. But even I don't give this a 5 or, 1 out of 5, 5 stars. Or 10 stars, give it a 10. I can't, because this album is where Genesis is trying new things and they're kind of desperate for a new sound. And the first song that greets you here is Down and Out, which is just a killer song. I love it, man. I've been listening to this album for 35, 40 years. I mean, back to when the album came out in 1978, of course my brothers, they didn't like it because there's no Hackett, there's no Gabriel, and this is where it was becoming the Phil Collins band, slowly but surely. But I think even Genesis didn't know at the time the direction of where they were going. And that's what I really like about And Then There Were Three. To me, this is like Genesis's version of Revolver. I should say Genocide. Genocide. This is their Revolver for sure, where they're just not sure what they're doing. They're just trying new things. They're just throwing things at the wall to see what sticks. And, Down and Out is killer. And Undertow. These songs are so interesting. These songs are way too interesting for their own good. Ballad of Big, which certainly could have been a hit song. It's a very nice song. The lyrics are a little trying too hard on many of these songs. But, of course, Snowbound, killer. That could be a hit. And Burning Rope is just awesome by Tony Banks. Banks wrote Undertow, too. It's not really a three-piece band, but they are just three guys patching together things in the studio. Of course, when they play live, there's 5 guys. Chester Thompson, who's amazing on drums. And, but this side one is so interesting, it really gets you curious about this band. At 1-800-449-8255, the Clark the Shark Show. If you were new to Genesis back in 1978, at the time, this album is going to get you into both the past and the future of Genesis. Some people are a little torn on this album. They think it's too commercial and too progressive at the same time. It's just confusing. And it is, certainly. This album is, the songs are really short for Genesis. You got songs in the 4-minute, 4.5, You got a bunch of songs here. Track 2, 3, and 4 on side 1. but we're talking very interesting. Very, very, very interesting album. I love Down and Out. The weird, just so weird, you know. The drums are just so weird, man, and the whole song is in a weird time signature, progressive rock at its greatest. I'm sure the other prog bands all around, like Yes and Jethro Tull and ELP and everybody, man, the Who, all of them had to have looked at this album and just were like, "Whoa, what is this? What is that?" Genesis, and then there were three, 1978. Because this album, if you crank this thing up loud and listen to this whole album, particularly side one, you're going to be blown away at what you hear. That being said, I still think like this album could have been better, but I don't know, man. The jury's out. I mean, I love this album, and I find myself listening to this album because it's good, not a guilty pleasure. Duke, I listen to because it's good, not so much a guilty pleasure. But of course, Abacab, I'll hardly listen to that. It's got interesting moments on it for sure. But it's mainly getting commercial, and then after that, the band just goes completely commercial. And of course, Phil solo, very commercial. He's got horns, and pretty soon these guys aren't Genesis anymore. They're just Phil Collins. Invisible Touch is just Phil with a backing band, and yet very much Genesis. Tony Banks has a hell of a lot to do with the sound, as does Rutherford. There's no doubt about it the whole way through, even when they get really commercial. Deep in the Mother Lode, killer, the version on the album, I think, is better than live. Many Too Many could be a hit song. It's like a Phil pop song. And Scenes from a Night's Dream, too. Great song. Could be a hit. As could Say It's All Right, Joe. The Lady Lies is fucking killer. And of course, the mega hit on the album, Follow You, Follow Me, the final song on the album, responsible for this album really selling. I think this was Genesis's first platinum album, and it's probably because Follow You, Follow Me is on it. And, Rutherford pretty much wrote that song, Of course, it's got a hell of a lot of Phil. No doubt. But you can tell from that song, Genesis are about to get really, really big. And maybe for not good reasons. But this album is definitely killer, man. I mean, if you take away Phil and his singing and just listen to the music, you won't find a more amazing or better Genesis album than this one right here from 1978, and then there were three. Just for Down and Out alone, and maybe Undertow. Killer songs. Snowbound is killer. I mean, like I said, so many songs on this album could have been hits. And at the time in 1978, Genesis were probably didn't have the money to do payola like they could do on the Duke tour or Abacab. And they just kind of let these songs go and twist in the wind. Otherwise, had Genesis had a lot of money for payola in 1978, I swear there could be 6 or 7 hit songs on this album, and then there were 3. And that being said, this album is hella prog, progressive. This album is in many ways a perfect blend of prog rock and commercial rock like you have never heard before. Genesis hits things on all cylinders, baby, on this album. And that being said, it could have been better. It almost seems like Genesis is lost. Like this isn't as good as, they've lost one Bullock from Wind and Wuthering. And in many ways, this album is not as good as Duke, the album, of course, that would come next. But in many weird ways, I like this album more than any other Genesis album. And I really don't know why. except for I can scrape up against all that I just said. 1-800-449-8255. The fabulous, amazing Clark the Shark Show. The best reviewer on YouTube. The only one that you need. My review here of And Then There Were Three will be the only one you need. Because I grew up with this album from the time I was 13, 14, listening to this album. And I knew somehow way back then that this would be the last great Genesis album. And I correctly saw that, even as a child at age 13, 14, 1979 at Newton Middle School. I knew Genesis would probably never make another album this great. And I was right. At 1-800-449-8255, the Clark the Shark Show from the Golden EIB Sharkraphone. And like I said, there are problematic things about this album where you will listen to it yourself and you're going to sit there and say, man, this could have been better if they just would have done this. Or if they just would have listened to Clark the Shark at 1-800-449-8255. But hey, what did I know, man? I was only 13 at the time. 1978, Genesis, And Then There Were Three. A band surviving with just three guys after being one of the most amazing five-piece bands with Peter Gabriel on vocals and Steve Hackett on guitar. How did they survive losing those two geniuses? And they got even bigger and better, man. I wouldn't say better, but they got bigger. Genesis became one of the biggest bands in the world. And maybe for all the wrong reasons. And maybe I, Clark the Shark, don't like it. And maybe neither do you. But you gotta hand it to them, people. Somehow, these three guys patched it together, pulled it together. They made this album. And then from there, baby, it was all gravy. They got bigger. Not necessarily better, but they got more commercial. And, I can't really say it's because of the great, amazing keyboard playing of Tony Banks or the amazing bass and guitar of Mike Rutherford and the drums of Phil. They got more commercial. They simplified their music. But for one amazing album, Genesis put all that incredible talent together on this album, which could be my favorite Genesis album. I'm not kidding you guys. I love And Then There Were Three, 1978 by Genesis. Because these songs are confused. This band seems lost. This band seems hopeless. It almost seems like this is their final album, but in a good way. Like they're finding themselves. They're completely desperate here. And in desperation, Genesis discovers whole new things about Genesis on this album. 1978, And Then There Were Three. Tony Banks, his keyboards, his atmospheres, his ambiance is amazing. Mike Rutherford, his guitar is right there with Hackett. His bass is right there with John Entwistle. He's right there with the greatest bassist in the world, Mike Rutherford. And Phil Collins, love him or hate him, his drumming is amazing on this album. His vocals, they're pretty good, man. And I think the three guys in Genesis, like I said before, these guys weren't even sure what the hell they were doing on this album, but they knew they had to get more commercial. They knew they had to try new things, and they had to try non-Genesis things to survive. And baby, they did it here on this album. And of course, after this album, the rest is history. Maybe not in a good way, maybe not in a great way, but love them or hate them, man. Genesis, I hate to say it, they became one of the biggest bands of all time. And this album was the catalyst to it all, for it all, whatever you want to say. Genesis, 1978, And Then There Were Three. Amazing album. And you just got the only review you will ever need of this album, and you got it from Clark the Shark, from the golden EIB Sharkerphone at 1-800-449-8255, the fabulous Shark. And I'm going to tell you guys once again, buy this album by Genesis. Crank this up and listen loudly to the whole album. And you'll discover it goes places where Wind and Wuthering doesn't go. Maybe even A Trick of the Tail doesn't go. Maybe even where Duke does not go. This album goes to a place in many ways where Genesis would never revisit ever again. At 1-800-449-8255, the Clark the Shark Show. And you just got the word, baby, right here. And I'm out of here. That's the VR, baby. I'm out. Peace.